Ada Whitfield had been calling the roll for 4 years, and for 4 years, no one had answered. Every morning she stood at the front of the small, whitewashed schoolhouse in Dry Creek, Montana Territory, sent by the Methodist Ladies Aid Society to teach the Western settlers how to read a ledger and sign their own names, and she read aloud the names she had written the night before onto the narrow roll sheet. Sarah Reed, Thomas Cade, Margaret Halloran, Lily Devereux, each one pronounced carefully, the way a person might water a row of plants no one would ever see. She paused at the end of the roll and listened. 20 wooden desks stood in 3 rows, empty. Dust gathered on the slanted tops in fine gray lines that caught the morning light. The wood stove she lit at 6 had warmed the room by 8, and the warmth stayed long after the ashes went out, as if the room were reluctant to let go of the only attention it ever received. Before we go further, if you're listening tonight from a kitchen or a porch or whatever quiet place has become yours at the end of the day, I'd love to know where you are. Tell me in the comments when you can. It's a small thing, but it makes the room feel less empty for both of us. She knew why no one came. The families had moved their children to bigger towns along the rail line at Helena, or out to homestead claims where there was no school at all and never would be. The men who remained were bachelors working the copper strikes south of town. Mayor Henry Cobb, who was also the liveryman, who was also the bartender at the only saloon that was not also a brothel, had told her plainly in the spring of her first year that the town was not likely to support a school it had never asked for. He had handed her a small stipend drawn from a fund nobody could quite explain, and he had said, "Miss Whitfield, you may keep the schoolhouse open on sufferance, but you'll have to do it without expectation." She had said yes. She had been 24 then. She had a fresh grief inside her chest the size of an open field. Her fiancé, Nathan Brewer, had been killed in a shaft collapse the autumn before, 2 months before the wedding, and the only thing she still knew how to do with any certainty was show up at the same place at the same time every day and do the next small thing in front of her. So she showed up. She wrote the names. She lit the stove. The town did not notice. The town did not, in any way she could measure, value what she was doing. The town simply allowed her to keep doing it, the way a town allows a broken clock to keep ticking in an empty station. For winters, for springs. Nobody came. She wrote letters to her sister in Illinois every Sunday and walked them down to the stage office herself, because she was not yet willing to give up on the practice of being believed in by someone. She read aloud to the empty desks every afternoon. She sang hymns on Saturday, the windows open, so the sound would carry past the schoolhouse lot and out to the road. She did not sing well. She sang anyway. And then, on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of September of her 4th year, a boy walked in. He stepped through the door without knocking. He was thin in the way a person is thin when they have been thin for a long time. He wore a coat too large for him, the kind of coat a boy's father might wear for 2 winters and then hand down. His shoes were split at the toe and had been tied back together with a strip of rawhide. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, as if he had rehearsed this coming in and was now uncertain about the timing. Then he looked at the empty desks, and he looked at her, and he said, in a voice that had not been used for several days, "Are you the teacher?" She said that she was. He said, "I can read some." She said, "That is what we are for." He did not sit in the first desk. He sat in the back, near the door. He did not take off his coat. He did not smile. He did not tell her his name. He sat with his hands folded on the desktop, watching her the way a rabbit watches a long fence line. She wrote the name C. Tate on the roll sheet in her careful hand, and she moved on to the day's lesson, and she did not ask him anything else that morning. She understood, the way a person understands weather, that he would tell her the rest when he was able. His name was Caleb Tate. He was 11 years old. His mother had died of diphtheria on a homestead claim when he was 6. His father had hauled him west the following summer as far as the freight yards at Corinne, Utah, where he had set the boy down one morning beside a stack of crates and walked away. He had said he would come back. He had not come back. Since then, Caleb had lived by his wits, sleeping in livery lofts when the weather turned, earning small coins for holding horses, eating what was offered and what was not offered. He had been run out of 2 other schools for stealing food from lunch pails. He believed, in the way a person believes the weather, that he was bad. He did not expect anyone to revise it. He came back the next morning. He came back the morning after that. Each day Ada wrote his name on the roll. Each day she read it aloud, and each day he answered here in a voice just loud enough for her to hear. The rest of Dry Creek noticed, eventually. They noticed because Dry Creek was the kind of town that noticed anything that affected the bottom line of a concern it considered its own. In the same week Caleb walked into her classroom. A cattle buyer named Silas C. Hager had completed the purchase of every head of livestock on the East Range and was in need of a fenced yard and a small office near the rail spur. He had, by the second Friday of October, become the largest single employer in the township. He had begun, that winter, to make his preferences known at the saloon each evening after supper. He preferred that the schoolhouse lot be acquired by the town and reallocated to him for the use of his cattle operation. He preferred this quietly and with great patience, and in language that talked always of the future of the township and never of his own pocket. He had the mayor's ear. The mayor had been heard to mutter, more than once, that a school with one student was not strictly a school. Ada heard the muttering, as one hears muttering through thin walls. She did not speak of it to Caleb. She did not change her routine. She taught him to read whole sentences from a torn copy of Robinson Crusoe she had paid 2 bits for at the dry goods store. She taught him the multiplication tables up to 12. She asked him, one afternoon in the late autumn, what his favorite sound in the world was. He thought for a long time, and then he said, a bell ringing to call somebody in. From somewhere safe. She knew she was being given something precious, and she knew she was being given something breakable. She taught him carefully, the way a person teaches a wild horse to take a bit. She never raised her voice. She never asked more than he could give on a given morning. She let him keep his coat on until the second week of November, when the stove had been hot long enough that the room was genuinely warm. He took the coat off then, on his own, without saying a word. She pretended not to notice. That was the first small rule between them. Some things get noticed by being carefully not noticed. By Christmas, the muttering had become a petition. Silas C. Hager, through the mayor and 2 other men on the council, formally requested that the township reallocate the schoolhouse lot, offering in exchange the sum of $1 and a promise that the school would be relocated, in time, to a small frame building on the other side of the rail spur. The relocation was described as imminent. The imminence was not pinned to any date that could be named. The Ladies Aid Society was petitioned for guidance and replied, in January, that the decision rested with the township. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. She read it at the kitchen table of her boarding house, and she folded it carefully, and she put it in the drawer with Nathan's last letter, and she went down to the schoolhouse, and she lit the stove. Caleb asked her that afternoon if anything was the matter. She said to him, no, Caleb. Nothing that has anything to do with you. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in the careful voice he used when he was breaking his own small rule, my mother used to say that the most reliable sign a person was about to be hurt was when they told you it had nothing to do with you. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, almost to herself, you don't have to be good at anything to deserve a chair at the table. He did not ask her to explain. He wrote it down on a scrap of paper and put it in his coat pocket. She understood what she had to do. She wrote to the town council. She wrote to Silas Hager directly. She wrote to the editor of the Helena newspaper, her sister's friend, requesting that he consider holding a hearing on the matter of school funding in the smaller settlements. She wrote her sister to ask whether the Ladies' Aid might designate Dry Creek as a recognized station school, which would, under the territorial statutes, place the schoolhouse under the protection of the territorial fund. The Ladies' Aid was willing to consider such a designation, provided Dry Creek could demonstrate, in good faith, a single enrolled student making demonstrable progress. Caleb, by the first week of February, could read a full page aloud without stumbling. He could name every state capital. He could recite the multiplication tables backward. She wrote the demonstration in her careful hand, and she posted it on the afternoon stage. By the third week of February, the town was aware that the schoolhouse lot might no longer be available for the taking. Silas C. Hager had begun, instead, to act. We have a rough question forming here, don't we? Now will the storm come? We already know it is coming. Now will the boy stay? We already know he wants to stay. But here is the real question, the one worth sitting with. When the world tells you that what you are doing is invisible, do you keep doing it because you believe it matters? Or do you stop because the cost has become impossible to carry? I'd love to know what you think in the comments below. On a Thursday morning in early March, Deacon Toby, who was the mayor's cousin and had made himself useful to Mr. Hager as foreman of the new cattle yard, arrived at the schoolhouse just after 8 o'clock with 2 other men and a writ of relocation. The writ was 3 pages long and very official. It said that the township, finding good cause to reallocate the quarter section on which the schoolhouse stood, would be taking possession of the structure and its contents at the end of the school day on Friday, and that Miss Whitfield and her one student would be entitled to occupy a temporary location in the freight shed by the following Monday morning. It said nothing about what would happen to the desks or the stove or the roll sheets or the small library crate behind the teacher's chair. Caleb arrived 20 minutes later, in his large coat, his split shoes tied with rawhide, and he saw the 3 men standing on the porch, and he stopped on the road and did not come forward. Ada Whitfield stepped to the threshold of the schoolhouse door. The light behind her was the color of the inside of an egg. She did not raise her voice. She said, in the voice she used when she was giving a spelling test, "Gentlemen, the children of this township have been promised instruction under the doctrines of the Territorial Fund. I intend to honor that promise today, and tomorrow, and on Monday, and until such time as the writ is lawfully set aside. You may enter this building when I am not in it." Deacon Toby said, in the tone a person uses when they are about to be reasonable about a thing they have already decided against, "Miss Whitfield, the writ has been signed by 2 magistrates." She said, "Then the writ will be set aside by a 3rd. That is the ordinary course of things." She stepped back into the schoolhouse. She closed the door. Caleb came through the back door a moment later, the one that opened onto the woodshed. He came and sat in the second desk from the front, and he set his hands flat on the slanted top, and he looked at her. She opened Robinson Crusoe to the page they had marked with a leaf. She said, "We left off here, where we are." He nodded. He read aloud, and his voice was steady. The men on the porch stood in the cold, holding the writ between them. Then Deacon Toby said something low to the other 2. They walked back to where their horses were tied. They did not enter. They did not return that day. The day after, the writ was contested by the Ladies' Aid through a circuit attorney in Helena. It was held in abeyance pending a formal hearing at the Territorial Courthouse. The hearing was scheduled for the 2nd Monday in April. The township, by then, was no longer a township of one opinion. It had become a place where every adult had been asked what they thought about the matter of a boy in a classroom. Some said he was the son of no one. Some said the schoolhouse was a schoolhouse and ought to be left alone. Some said the matter of Mr. Hager and his cattle was none of their concern, but they said it uneasily. Henry Cobb, the mayor, who had been the liveryman, who had been the bartender, who had told Ada Whitfield 4 years earlier that the town was not likely to support a school it had never asked for the floor at the hearing. He was 71 years old. He stood up at the bench, and he looked at the 3 magistrates, and he said, "My wife read to our children at the kitchen table for 15 years, because we could not afford a teacher, and our children grew up worse for the absence." He said, "Miss Whitfield is the first teacher this town has had who asked only to be allowed to do the work." He said, "There is 1 student in her school, and I would like to be in my own memory, because that would mean there was somebody of mine worth looking after." He said, "I am not a sentimental man, but I drove my oldest daughter 40 miles by wagon to her first day of school when she was 7, and I wept in the road afterward, and I have not been ashamed of that weeping. You may take my livestock and my livery stable and my house on the lane. You will not take the schoolhouse." He sat down. The room was quiet for a long time. The writ was, in the end, formally dismissed. The Territorial Fund, by the close of April, was designated for the support of the schoolhouse in perpetuity. Mr. Hager's cattle operation was relocated to the North Range. The relocation cost him, in cash and in lost time, a sum every adult in town understood to be considerable. Silas C. Hager, that summer, sold most of his cattle to a buyer in Cheyenne. He was not, by the autumn of that same year, the largest single employer in the township. He was, by the following spring, no longer resident in the township. The schoolhouse lot, in the years that followed, remained exactly as it had been. The small whitewashed building, the hitching post, the woodshed, the row of saplings that Ada had asked the township to plant along the south fence in memory of her students who had not yet arrived. That part of the story settles like dust after a long wind. But what was given between 2 people, in the privacy of a room with 20 empty desks, settled into something else entirely, and that is the part worth telling. Caleb, as you have already begun to suspect, did not begin as a child who thought he deserved a chair at the table. He had been let down by every adult he had ever relied on, beginning with the man who had set him down beside the freight crates in Corinne, and continuing through a long tally of teachers, deacons, liverymen, and one woman in a sod house who had taken him in for 2 weeks for the bounty the county was paying for the care of orphan children. He had not been beaten. He had been, in the way that may be worse, forgotten. He had been given meals and arranged sleeping places and not, in any of those arrangements, been asked what his name was. He had been called, by more than one of those adults, the boy, as if the word were his name. Ada did not call him the boy. She called him Caleb. The name entered him the way warm water enters a cold cup, slowly, and made the cup, which had been cracked, hold together. She noticed when he flinched at raised voices. She lowered her voice accordingly. She noticed when he could not eat the midday bread because the crust had a familiar shape. She changed the bread. She noticed when he stood at the edge of the schoolyard for a long time before entering. She stood at the edge of the schoolyard herself, on those mornings, and she did not wave him in. She simply made sure he knew she was there. She understood, without being told, that the act of waving a child in was, in his memory, the prelude to being abandoned. So she did not wave. She was simply there. It was on a Saturday in late November that he came to her near the stove at the end of the afternoon. He had been trying, for the better part of an hour, to articulate something. He had begun and stopped several times. She had let the silence be the room they were both in. He said, "Miss Whitfield, my mother had hands like pine cones cracked open. They were rough and they were warm." He said, "I haven't talked about them in 3 years because I thought if I did, I'd forget what they sounded like when she moved them along my hair at night." She was very still. She said, "Tell me what they sounded like." He said, "It sounded like a small fire in another room. It sounded like she was checking on me, even when she was already there." She reached across the small distance between them, and she took one of his hands in hers. She held it for a moment. Then she said, in the careful voice a person uses when they are about to break their own rule, "My fiancé, before he died, used to take my hand and hold it the way a person holds a rope they are about to pull a great weight with. He would close his fingers individually, one at a time, like he was gathering himself up. He died with one of those fingers curved around his thumb in his pocket. I would not have known otherwise that he had been reaching for me when it happened." Caleb did not speak for some time. Then he said, "I think you are the first person who has ever told me something real on purpose." She said, "I think the world mostly leaves us alone because it doesn't know what to do with us. But somebody, somewhere, keeps writing down the names." He nodded. He did not let go of her hand for a long time. If anything in this story has touched you tonight, and I suspect, if you have listened this far, something has, I'd be grateful if you would leave a like on this video. It costs you nothing, and it does a great deal to keep these stories coming. If this channel has become something you look forward to, the subscribe button is right there, and it would mean more than I can easily say. For now, settle back in, and let me carry you to the end of this one. The months that followed were not easy. The territorial fund did not arrive until the late summer. Ada continued to teach Caleb through the spring in the schoolhouse as it stood. He learned to read with an inflection that suggested he understood what the sentences were about. He learned, in the way a child learns when an adult is simply paying attention, that the world could be asked to make small concessions to him, and that concessions did not necessarily turn into abandonment. He asked Ada, once, in May, if she would consider him her son. She said that she would. He said he was glad to have her consider it either way. The town, by the spring of the second year, had begun to send other children to the schoolhouse. By the third year the desks were largely full. By the fourth year there was a wait list. By the fifth year, the township was petitioning the Ladies' Aid for the construction of a second schoolhouse, and the Ladies' Aid was providing the funds without being asked. Caleb was 15 when Ada sat him down on the porch at the end of a long summer afternoon and told him she thought he ought to consider applying to the normal college in Helena, which was accepting young men of limited means who showed aptitude for teaching. He said he did not think a person of his history ought to be trusted with other people's children. She said, "I have trusted you with my own peace for 5 years, and you have been, at every important turn, the person I would have chosen." He asked her how she could be so sure. She said, "In this township, every adult has by now watched you become a person. If a township can watch you become a person and not forget it, then a college can be trusted to do the same." He applied. He was admitted. He left Dry Creek on the morning stage the following September. Ada stood on the porch as the stage passed, and she did not wave, because she had understood, across all those years, that waving was what people did when they were not certain they would be seen again. He had been seen. She was certain. He wrote her from Helena every Sunday for the duration of his training. When he finished, he wrote that he had been offered a position in a small town called Painted Post, and that he had accepted. She wrote back to ask if the town had a schoolhouse. He wrote that it had been recently constructed, and that it was small, and that it was whitewashed, and that the desks at present were empty. She wrote him back a single line in her careful hand. The line was this: build it slow. And so he did. Time moved on. Winter came. Spring followed. The schoolhouse in Dry Creek was, in those later years, a place where a great many children learned a great many things, including how to read aloud without stumbling, and how to write a clean hand, and how to ask a question of an adult without flinching. The saplings along the south fence grew up to be a small windbreak. On a morning in early June, almost 9 years after the boy had first stepped through the door, Caleb came back. He was 20 years old. He was taller than Ada had remembered, and his shoulders had filled in, and he carried himself the way a person carries themselves when they have been entrusted with the care of other people's children for long enough that it has become the posture of their adult life. He arrived on the morning stage. He walked the half-mile to the schoolhouse. He did not knock. He stepped through the door in the way a person steps through a door when they know what is on the other side of it. Ada was at the teacher's desk, marking a roll sheet for the day. There were now 17 names on it. She looked up. She saw him. She did not speak for some time. Then she said, in the voice she had used when she had first heard a small voice answer here from the back desk, "You are taller than I remember." He smiled. He took off his hat. He said, "I have come home for a week before I take the position at Painted Post." He said, "I have something to show you." He reached into his coat pocket, and he brought out a small object wrapped in a square of muslin. He set it on her desk in front of her. He unwrapped it. It was a piece of chalk, smoothed at one end and rounded at the other. He said, "A child in Painted Post has been asking me for a year, on every Friday afternoon, where chalk comes from. I told her I would find out and bring her back an honest answer." Ada laughed. It was the kind of laugh a person laughs when they have been standing very long still and a small thing has finally set them free. The chalk had been smoothed, the way a person might smooth a piece of wood at the end of a long afternoon of carving, with the pad of a thumb against a flat stone. Caleb had held it for the better part of a year across the territory, and the time had smoothened it. She said, "You smoothed it." He said, "I have been smoothing things for longer than I realized." She said, "Sit down." He sat in the second desk from the front, the one he had claimed on the morning of the writ, and he rested his hands flat on the slanted top in the same way he had rested them that morning. Then he said, "Miss Whitfield." He said, "That morning we were in the schoolhouse with the door closed and the writ outside. I made you a promise. I did not say it aloud. I am going to say it aloud now." He said, "On the morning the boy walked into this room, he did not know that he was going to be seen. He was a freight yard boy who had been passed through so many pairs of hands that he had stopped expecting any one of them to remember him. He said, you remembered him. You remembered his name. You remembered to write it on the roll every morning. You remembered to ask what his favorite sound was. You remembered to change the bread." He said, "I have built my life on the fact that you remembered." She did not say anything for some time. Then she said, almost to herself, in the voice a person uses when they are about to close a long letter, "As do I." He stayed for a week. He helped her lay new floorboards in the classroom. He went with Ada to the cemetery on the east edge of town, where there is a small stone for Nathan Brewer and a smaller one for the children who had been Ada's students, even though none of those children had died in this township. Caleb cut the grass around the stones with a small hand scythe he had found in the tool shed. He did not ask who the children were. He understood that he was one of them. On the morning he left, Ada walked him to the stage office. The morning was the kind one remembers for the rest of one's life, clear and cool, and smelling of cut hay and warm wood, and the bell at the livery stable being rung for water. They stood on the platform together for a moment. Then he turned and he looked at her, and he said, "Miss Whitfield, what do you think a person's life is for?" She thought for a long time. Then she said, "I think a person's life is for sitting down with somebody at the end of a long walk and saying, 'Here is what I carried.' I think that is all of it." He nodded. He took off his hat. He set it on his chest for a moment. the way a person does when they are about to say a small thing that they have been carrying for a long time. Then he said, "Here's what I carried." He said, "A teacher who never stopped calling the roll." She took his hand, and she held it for a long moment. Then she said, "Build it slow." The stage pulled away. She watched it go. She did not wave. She turned and she walked back to the schoolhouse the half-mile she had walked 10,000 times before, and she opened the door, and she went in, and she sat down at the teacher's desk. She took up the chalk. She wrote the day's date in her careful hand on the board. Then she wrote the names. Sarah, Thomas, Margaret, Lily, Caleb. She said each one aloud. The room was not empty. She rang the bell at the window. The sound carried, as it always had, past the lot, and out to the road, and onto the rail spur. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the bell, a man who had once been a boy carried a wooden slate in his coat pocket. The slate had been cut by Ada Whitfield from an old fence board that winter 9 years before. The corners had been rough then. He had smoothed them, over the years, with the pad of his thumb. If you have loved this story, the next one is about a stagecoach driver who lost everything he had on a single winter night and was given back by a stranger at a roadhouse, something he did not know he had lost. We will be back next week with that one. Wherever you are tonight, thank you for listening. Good night.